Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. And yes, today I have another garment from my recent verdigris lookbook, the tie-dye dress. This is of course done with ice dyeing, all those techniques I was experimenting with earlier in the year. So this is geode tied and then ice dyed to get these effects on this fabric. And I'll show you exactly how I went about dyeing the fabric, talk about the colors I used and the process I used for that. And then I will go ahead and show you how I did the pattern drafting for this dress and put it together. And seeing as that means we have a lot to get to today, let's go ahead and dive on in. And I begin with 1.5 yards of cotton sateen from Joann Fabrics. Their cotton sateen over there in their bottom weights section is a really lovely weight of sateen. It's a nice medium weight sateen. It's not too shiny, it's not too matte, it's not too thick, and it has a little bit of stretch in it as well, which works well for comfort. So I really like their cotton sateen over there. It doesn't come in a wide variety of colors, but of course it does come in white, which really is the only color you have to have something come in order to create any color possible, which is kind of what we're doing today. So I have 1.5 yards of cotton sateen that has been soaked in a soda ash solution. For more information on that, I will link you in a card up here to my original ice dyeing video, and then I did another video all about geode ice dyeing, which is how I am tying this fabric here today as well. I'm using a waxed cord called sinew here to tie off these little nodes in the fabric. You can see I'm grabbing a pinch of fabric, like squishing it down, not being very precious about it in any way. You want it to be as organic and natural looking as possible in the end, or if you do want it to look organic and natural, you don't want to be too precious about this. So I'm grabbing up a, big handful of fabric here and then just tying it off every few inches here. And again, don't make your sections exactly the same if you want it to look more natural in the end. So kind of just randomly tying it off into its geode pattern. Again, I have a whole video about geode tie dyeing. I will link that in the description for you. And I can also link you over to the two channels I watch the most while learning how to do this, Fun Endeavors Tie-Dye and Belladonna Dyes, who are masters of geode tie-dye like this. And watching their videos was how I learned to do this. So I will link you back over there to kind of cite my sources in some ways on how I learned to do this. But of course, instead of using a t-shirt today or a scarf or anything like that, I'm just using 1.5 yards of fabric. And because the thicker the section is, the harder it is for all the dye to penetrate through and you not to end up with white sections in the end. That's why I'm only using 1.5 yards at a time here. I just tied one piece, now I'm tying another piece. I'm not tying them exactly the same. Again, I want it to be organic and different shapes, but I will be using the same dye bath and the same set of colors on each piece of fabric so they will still match. But of course I don't want them to match exactly or anything like that. I'm just trying to create random geode dyed agate looking yardage. And to do that I'm using 2 different pieces just because the larger and bulkier the sections are, the harder it is for the dye to penetrate all the way. So I want to make sure that I have pieces of fabric that are big enough to cut out what I need, but not too big so that my sections of the geodes become too bulky. I am going to dye these sections of fabric in the muck, as it were, so they will be sitting in their own runoff from the ice melting. But because this would take a lot of ice to fill this container, I'm filling up some of the main sections between the sections of geode with some tin foil here, just so I don't have to fill this whole bucket with a ton of ice, because sadly the snow has melted here and now I have to use actual purchased bagged ice, and one doesn't want to spend too much money on something that's going to melt, I'm giving this a quick spritz of soda ash solution just so the dye sticks to everything as these geodes are fully dry. Now I will list the colors of dye I used for this project in the description below, but I'm just going to add them all randomly to different sections of my little geodes here. So I'm putting this as dye under ice to start with here. So here I'm using rust brown. I'm just going to fill in several different sections along both of these sort of chromosomes of fabric. I always think these end up looking a little bit like chromosomes. That could just be me. But just filling in some of the little nodes of these buddies. I was actually referencing a tie-dye t-shirt that I saw on Instagram for the color palette for this. Of course, people don't usually list what colors of dye they use, but in general, I was like, oh, this might kind of work for a similar style. I was looking at stones like agate and also opal to kind of create a sort of lagoon colorway, not necessarily very turquoise or very malachite, just something sort of strange and in between, and kind of a fantasy stone for this one. But in general, I'm using warm browns, a little bit of warm gold colorways, and then lots of ceruleans and turquoise and some green in here for this project today. And again, I will list all of the color names that I ended up using in the description below. These are all Dharma Trading Company dyes. These are the Procyon dyes, which are for cellulosic natural fibers, which is what we have here with cotton today. I'm putting a little bit of darker blue on here. You have to be very careful with that dark blue because it's very potent, I've learned. But once I have dye all over the sections that I want here, that powdered dye, just putting that on with a plastic spoon, as you can see, I'm going to layer some ice on top of all of this. That's right. And I was having a really good time with tie-dye earlier in the year when there was plenty of ice and snow that hadn't melted in our backyard, so I could go and grab ice anytime I wanted. But of course now I've had to clean up the sewing room so that I can get to sewing as opposed to just dyeing all the time. Although I was having a great time with all those tie-dye projects earlier in the year. I'll have to wait for it to snow again, and that will become tie-dye season perhaps. It would be fun to do it in the summertime as well. It's just that I would have to purchase ice as opposed to just grab it from the yard. And you can see here, this is going to take 2 bags of ready ice, plus a couple of extra cubes from upstairs. Our fridge ice maker doesn't work, so I have to make ice cubes otherwise, which is why you see me buying ice as opposed to just using stuff in the fridge. But I am wearing my N95 mask while doing this, while working with the powdered dyes. You really don't want to be breathing in powdered dye, so remember to wear a face mask while working with the dye until it starts to become liquid instead of powder. Just, you don't want to aspirate the heavy metals in these dyes and the weird things that it's made out of. It's not for going into the body, it's for wearing on the body, all right? But you want to have a healthy coating of ice, at least 2 or 3 inches of ice on top of everything. And you can see I'm sprinkling on a little bit of extra soda ash on this. And in the end here, before I just set it and forget it, as they say in the tie-dye channels, I am going to put a couple of colors just sprinkled over the top here, just to give it a overall consistency with both pieces of these. I'm going to sprinkle on some green and then some Shitake mushroom brown, which is a color that splits apart quite a lot, so it's good for giving a naturalistic, very random effect in the end. Hoping for the best here with these thick pieces of fabric. Sprinkle on some green, sprinkle on some brown. Leave this to melt when it looks like this, and it's in this black bracken water, and you think there's no way that this is not just going to be a muddy brown all the way through. But weirdly enough, because the dyes have finished reacting, I guess, in some ways, it doesn't absorb all of the black colored dye. It comes out looking like this. You would never think that these light mint greens and bright blues come out of that dye bath, but they do. So yes, I removed these pieces from the dye, rinsed them out in cold water in the sink down here. I have a utility sink in my sewing room because originally it was a painting room, fun fact. So I rinsed those in the sink, gradually warmed the water up, untied the geodes, all that jazz, rinsed the pieces out until they ran relatively clear, and then threw them in the washing machine. I washed these with a special detergent that I got from Dharma as well, just to help set everything. And then I did go ahead and throw the fabric into the dryer, just to make sure I got any shrinkage of the cotton out of the way before I started making anything with this fabric. Before I could get to this step where I'm using the pattern to cut out the fabric, I need to make the pattern, so let's go ahead and do that. As is usual, I'm starting with my basic bodice block here today. I'm going to be making a sleeveless dress with a slightly tipped up neckline and a slightly crossed over skirt, so I'll show you how I made this pattern today. I'll go ahead and give this a trace, mark in my darts, my apex, anything relevant that I will need. Draw on those dart legs here so I can start to move them around. And all I'm going to do for the darts today is I'm going to move the waist dart into the side here as well, so I have 2 side darts instead of a side dart and a waist dart. I am going to add a center front seam as well, so I'll go ahead and do that. And for this neckline, it's actually a very easy modification to add on. So you come in along the shoulder seam towards the shoulder from the neckline a 1/2 inch, come up 1.5 inches, and then draw a curve along that new axis you've kind of created along the shoulder seam. That's your new shoulder seam, and then draw a curve in the other direction down into your neckline. Of course, I'm going to add this little peaked point to my neckline as well because it's me, and I love these pointy necklines. I've been doing them quite a lot over the past couple of years. But I'll go ahead and start to cut this out now that we have the main modifications going on. Now here at the underarm, just because I'm going to be doing this as a sleeveless garment today, I'm going to take off about 1/4 inch, maybe a little more than that, right here at the very underarm area, just so that it's not too tight up on my body when I'm wearing this, when there's no sleeve sewn into it, I suppose. And at this point I'm starting to think maybe I don't want to do my angle dart where it normally is, and then a second one. I think I'm going to move the angled dart that's up into the side seam already here down a little bit. So I'm going to actually close this dart, weirdly enough, and move it down to that new line I had drawn. And I'm going to draw a new dart leg from the side into the apex. So I'm going to put the waist dart into that new higher line, and I moved my side dart into the new lower side dart originally. Just because I make these decisions on the fly. Therefore, sometimes I'm not thinking about, will this be confusing for viewers? I'm just thinking, how do I want the dress to look? And I wish I could keep both things in mind at all times, but it's just not always possible. But now I'll finally close the waist dart into that new side dart. So we have 2 side darts, one a little bit lower than the original. And yeah, again, the dart fullness stays the same. You can move them anywhere you want. It is, however, better to, if you're going to try and explain it later on, do something a little bit more coherent than whatever the heck just went on there. But I can only apologize. This is past me. I know she made the decisions that felt right at the time, but current me can't always understand. I'll draw my new dart legs again. We don't want to sew our darts right to the apex. I need to come out at least an inch from those. That's just what works for me and my body. I think the standard recommendation is 5/8 of an inch away from the apex. I usually use an inch to an inch and a quarter, basically, away from my apex for actually sewing my darts, because I don't want things to be too pointy, but they do need to be kind of pointy because I wear a slightly pointier style of bra, the Bali brand flower bra, which is a more 1940s shape of bra that I do prefer. And so my garments are a little pointier for that reason. And I always fit my basic blocks over the style of bra I plan to wear with the clothes, so that's just why that is. I'm going to go ahead and square off a line on a new piece of paper and trace the entire top half of this to make an all-in-one facing. So trace the entire top of this garment, the entire shoulder area. I will come down 3 inches at the underarm and draw in a swooping curve, kind of avoiding the bust here as best I can, or at least the point of the bust, from the underarm area to the neckline, where this will be coming to quite a V in the front here. You saw me do this style of facing in the sleeveless sequined top video, which I think was last year. I can link that in a card here, because I think that version is probably a little bit more understandable than this today, just because of the tipped up neckline and the tie-dye fabric makes things a little bit hard to understand what's going on, but we'll see how we do. That other video I showed the same style of sewing the facing, so if you want more instruction on that, I'll have that other video linked for you in the card and also in the description. But I of course need to work on the back of this, so let's go ahead and again square off another line in my 1 inch of seam allowance here that I prefer along my center back, and trace in my bodice back with its dart. All that jazz. Again, I need to lower this armhole just that little bit like I did in the front to make sure that matches up. Again, come out a 1/2 inch and then 1.5 inches up here along the neckline, and then I'll just line up my shoulder seam and trace the front, because I want to make sure that curve is exactly the same, of course. And I will connect that to my center back neck by bringing that neck up a good 2 inches here, just to make sure that has enough space back there. And I'm actually going to tilt that out towards the center back. You can see I have 1/4 inch of tilt added onto that back neckline as well. This again just is extra space for my neck. I've done this without that extra tilt before, and it still works, but to lie perfectly smooth back here, it's nice to tilt it out just a little bit. Seeing as there is a center back seam anyhow, or closure anyhow, might as well just give myself that extra little bit of space at the back of the neck for a smoother fit. Then I can go ahead and cut everything out for this, and then again I will need to make a back-facing pattern. So again, I will trace the top half of this buddy. See this scrap piece of paper? Will this have enough room? Just barely, maybe. Let's go ahead and see if I can get away with that. Tracing it with pencil, which is very against the rules down here in my sewing room, because pencil is what you should be using, but of course, as you can see, it does not show up on camera at all, so I have to trace over it with my markers. That's why you always see me using markers for drafting. They work very well. They are technically less precise than pencil, but of course, mechanical pencil does not show up on our camera here, so for me, pencil doesn't work, but for you, it probably works fine. But again, I need to come 3 inches down from my arm side here, just to try to make this scrap paper work for me. And then yes, draw a swoop up into the center back. I'm going to leave this kind of thick along the center back because I'm going to start my zipper about 5 inches down from the top of this collar and just finish the top of the collar area with hook and eye closures instead. You could even do like a keyhole back here if you wanted to, or of course have a lower back neckline. This has that raised collar, so I wanted to keep consistent with that. But I'll cut away this excess paper. Now we have our facing for the front and the back, and I can start working on the skirt pattern. Because this is going to be a bit asymmetric in the front, I wanted to trace a full front of my skirt pattern here. So this is my basic block skirt pattern, aka a pencil skirt pattern, that is traced mirrored along the center front. And I'm just going to decide how much of a cutaway I want to do over here and then lower the hem along that. So just curve that down an extra 3 inches along here. And then I'm just going to draw a curve up into the hip. So I'm about 5 or 6 inches down from the hip along this side seam. I'm just going to draw a shallow curve to make this skirt whatever shape I want, honestly. You can draw whatever shape in here you want as long as you know how you want to finish it. You can do scallops and different swoopier shapes if you would like. Just make sure you know how you're going to finish it. This I'm going to finish with bias tape today, which has no problem with these sort of shallow curves. But if you did scallops and things like that, you might want to just fully line this. It'll be easier to finish that off. I will bring in and narrow the other side of the skirt about 1.5 inches as well. So you'll see that in just a moment. There we go, cut that off. And then I have my regular skirt back pattern here. So I want to make sure I'm folding that in the same amount that I narrowed this, because I'm not going to make a new skirt back pattern. I don't need a new skirt back pattern. It's going to match up, as you can see, with the side seam of this new front very easily. And this front is going to be 2 layers. So I have that new top layer that I just drafted, and then I'll use my regular pattern as the underlayer on the front as well. So this is going to eventually, the underlayer will peek through like this, like so. So for the underside of the skirt, because I only have so much of my tie-dye fabric, I will just cut the side that will show out of the tie-dye fabric, and then I'm actually going to cut the other side of the skirt out of some cotton muslin that I had sitting down here that had been pre-washed. So it won't shrink, luckily. So one side of the skirt that is unseen, that's completely underneath the flap and like even in the wind, it wouldn't be seen. I might as well conserve tie-dye fabric and cut that out of something else. But one of the hardest things about this is figuring out where you want to place the pattern on the tie-dye fabric, because you don't really want to have bullseyes in the center of the bust or like other centralized areas. When you're drawing attention to different areas of the body, you have to be careful with bullseye sort of fabric. So the only area where I used like the central geode form was actually on the center back of the bodice. That's the only place where I really aligned it. Otherwise, a lot of the centers of the geode, one ended up on my shoulder, kind of like along the side seam of the skirt. So I was trying to place these carefully to both utilize the parts of the fabric that I really liked how it had come out and the colors of the fabric, the areas of the fabric that I thought were really pretty colors, but also being careful not to place the bullseyes anywhere too conspicuous. It'd be really fun to do like a quilt that looked like marble, pieced marble and stone pieces from like Italy and like 18th century and beforehand in Italy, where they were using different colors of stone and marble to make like tabletops and stuff, to do a quilt in that style using different colors of ice-dyed fabric in this geode way. It would be very fun. I mean, extremely time consuming, but I think it would come out really cool and make an excellent bedspread. But of course I need to mark all of my darts on my pieces now that they are cut out. So I'm using some colored pencils and tailor's chalk and my pattern to do that. Then I can pinch and pin my darts and start setting these things next to the machine. And I will not be lining the strass today. I'm just going to be using the facings to finish the top, and then bias tape to hem the hem. So because I'm not lining this, I will go ahead and run the raw edges of the seams through my serger just to finish off that raw cut edge. You could of course cut out with pinking shears or use rayon seam binding on edges as well. If you want to do due diligence, use rayon seam binding. It is the more couture finish. I actually peeked inside the hem of one of the skirts while I was visiting Alexander McQueen when I was in London. I was looking at like a cotton twill sort of safari style skirt, and they had finished the seams inside with seam binding, not serging. That is one of the main differences between like standard fashion and like designer level and moving up to couture fashion, is that there's going to be rayon seam binding or silk seam binding. Some sort of seam binding usually is used on very fancy garments. And then of course you see serging all the time in regular like ready-to-wear clothes, I suppose. Not necessarily designer ready-to-wear clothes, but ready-to-wear clothes in the sense that like what you find at the department store or Banana Republic or, you know, normal stores, I suppose. And of course, I always say that I only serge my raw edges because I have the serger, and I only have the serger because my mom bought it for a special project, then stopped sewing, so I appropriated it, commandeered the serger into my process because she was no longer using it. She got like a wild whim one time and like a good coupon, and that's how the serger entered our house. It's of course just a like mid-consumer level serger from Joann's, but I would love to have an industrial one someday, maybe when I'm in my next sewing studio. Because actually the industrial ones I've worked with quite a lot, because when I worked in a factory setting, when I was managing a sewing factory for a brief moment before I became a YouTuber, I worked with a industrial serger all day long, so I'm actually quite comfortable working on a Juki serger. I'd love to have one, so one day perhaps. But yeah, still marking all my darts, marking all the skirt darts as well, for both the underlayer of the front and the top layer of the front. So there's 2 skirt backs, there's 3 skirt fronts, because the underlayer is 2 pieces, a left and a right for the underlayer, and then this top piece has all 4 darts across the top of the waist here. Many darts to sew, of course in my sewing that's quite usual, because I sew fitted garments with a vintage hourglass inspired silhouette, so lots of darting to be done for me. But at least while I'm doing repetitive tasks, I get to look at this incredibly unrepetitive fabric with its very galaxy-like organic shapes here in this tie-dye. I need to do more tie-dye fabric like this. There's no reason to, so I shouldn't be spending money on white fabric to tie-dye, because I'm supposed to be saving money for a house, but I would like to do more like this in the future. So one day, maybe I'll have a laundry room in my next house that I can use as like also a tie-dye room. That would be so nice. Sometimes I find these Victorians for such a deal over on the East Coast, where they have like dozens of rooms that I would have to think of a use for each room because there's just so many of them. But I quite like a higgledy-piggledy floor plan. I don't want open concept. I want a closed concept, please, with rooms that are just for hat storage and rooms that are just for tie-dye and things like that. But over here on the Singer 99K, I can of course sew all those darts just using a random like sludgy green color of thread that I had in my stash, because honestly I could use so many different colors of thread with this and it wouldn't really make a difference. It's going to match some sections and not match others, so I went with a sludgy sage green. And I'm just going to start at the large end of my dart, sew off the tip of the point, and then tie those threads shut, sewing these the same way I always sew darts, especially in this cotton sateen, which is incredibly easy to work with, one of my favorite fabrics to work with ever, and one of my favorite fabrics to wear. It's a nice medium weight. I feel slightly held in by it, and yet I can of course just throw this in the wash, which is very nice. Always remember to pre-wash your cotton sateens, because then you can just throw the dress in the wash, and there's nothing better than that, especially in the summertime. You can see here from this angle how I line my pieces up behind the machine on the blue table of doom, so we can just reach for the next one, sew the next dart, sew the next dart, sew the next dart, and then next to me on my left-hand side is the ironing board, so I'm just setting these on the ironing board afterwards so I can come over here and press them. So I'll just press all my darts, and it's after I press the darts and give the pieces a quick press that I go ahead and run the raw edges through the serger, so that's what I'm doing over here. Just running these through. My serger doesn't have a blade, so I don't have to really worry about it cutting anything extra off on accident, but I just run the raw edges through the serger to create a nice finish for them so they don't ever come unraveled. Though again, I'm not super worried about that kind of thing with something like this. I don't use a lot of loosely woven fabrics because I find them irritating to work with in general. Something like this doesn't really fray much. And my first step for beginning to construct this dress is actually going to be lining up my front facings along the front neckline. And I'll actually use a ruler and sketch in what I need to do around this point just so I don't get too lost with some tailor's chalk here. So I know exactly where to pivot my needle when stitching in this neckline over on the machine. But I'm leaving the last 1.5 inches or so next to the shoulder seam unsewn for this, because we're going to get to that later. But I do need to finish off the neckline, like the center front neckline area of this, so I can sew the center front of the garment itself together in a moment. So I'll show you that. Was a bit of a strange order of operations for this one, just because I have this large all-in-one facing up here and this raised neckline. That'll just sew the center front of the facing to the center front of my piece for left and right here. Again, I'm going to leave the needle down, bring the presser foot up, pivot around, put the presser foot back down, and then keep stitching like so. And again, stopping about 2 inches short of the shoulder seam here, so I can have working space up there for the other steps I need to do. All right, so now that I have that facing sewn on, I need to go ahead and sew my center front. How am I going to do that? I'm going to swoop this buddy out of the way here, give it a little bit of a press, like so, and then I can line up my center front. I need to clip my curves and press my neckline nicely, but we'll get to that in a minute. Again, here's the other side here. I can line that up, and the facings match up, like so, and I can sew my center front seam, which comes up an additional 2 inches from where those facings meet, of course, so that there's a bit of facing below the point of the V. I just need to make sure I'm sewing exactly along the stitching line and catching both sides in the same place so that everything ends up nice and smoothly aligned in the end. Bring this over here. So facings out of the way, they're under my right hand. I can go ahead and sew my center front seam like so for my bodice pieces. 1/2 inch seam allowance, 12 stitches per inch, the usual over here. So yes, now my point of my V is nicely finished like this. My facing is all connected and I don't even have to tack it down because it's already in one with the seam in that way. I'll just give that a quick press and then we can start to work on attaching the rest of the facings and shoulder seams and putting this bodice together in the unique way that you do sleeveless all-in-one facings like this. Again, I will have in the card and the description below a link to my other video where I do this style of facing, just because it's a little harder to see what's going on in this fabric because the fashion fabric and the facing fabric are the same. That makes this a little bit hard to follow, so I apologize for that. But of course, there was no facing fabric that was exactly going to match this very well, so I went with using the same fashion fabric. But I'm going to grab my back facings now and pin the shoulder seams of the facings to the front facings that are already half sewn on here. So again, I left a little bit of this facing open along the shoulder seam so that I have room to work around up here. And I'm going to just right sides together, pin my facing backs onto my facing fronts. The fact that the facing fronts are already attached to the garment mostly does not affect this in any way. I mean, visually it makes it a little confusing to see what's going on, but I'm just taking my facing here, the back facing, laying it right sides together down on the front facing along the shoulder seams here, so I can sew the shoulder seam in this even though the front facing is already half attached to the bodice. I know this is a bit confusing. It would be easier to understand what was going on if the fabrics were different, but I promise I'm just sewing the shoulder seam of my facings. So right sides together, front and back together. It just so happens that the fronts are already attached because I had to finish that neckline in advance. And once those shoulder seams on the facings are sewn together, I can go ahead and of course clip the little curve that curves up the neckline here and give those a press. So this is the shoulder seam on my facing now sewn like so. This is actually a very easy way to do this, and it feels very satisfying to do an all-in-one facing like this. It's just a little bit confusing to try and explain what's going on if you don't understand, so I do apologize. Again, I have that other video where I show how to do this, and hopefully that will be illustrative as well if you need another refresher on this sort of facing technique. And I think actually Tasha just put out a video on all-in-one facings. I haven't watched it yet, but she's so good at explaining and is an excellent seamstress. So I would probably, I'll link her video below in the description as well, because I'm sure it's excellent. I would never have learned how to do hand-sewn buttonholes without Tasha's tutorial on her blog, so I have long relied on her excellent skills. But once my facings are sewn together along the shoulder seam, I can then go ahead and sew the shoulder seams for the bodice itself. Again, I left myself some room to work at the very tip of the neck, so I have all the space to be able to sew these on. Again, imagine it as if the fronts weren't already sewn together, you know. It's just the kind of extra step going on here. But again, I just sewed the shoulder seams in the actual bodice pieces this time. And again, I will clip those curves, press those open. It's the exact same shape of seam. It's just in the bodice instead of the facing. This fabric is at least very pretty and fun to look at, and I love the colors going on here, even if it makes explaining this process sort of irritating and difficult. Alright, so my facings are all together, my bodice is all together-ish. The front neckline is sewn already, I just have to sew the rest of the neckline. So now that my facings are sewn together at the shoulder seam, my bodice is sewn together at the shoulder seam, I can sew the rest of this neckline. All of this is facilitated, the movement, being able to do all this all-in-one facing in this way is facilitated by not having the side seams sewn yet, so that's really what's allowing us to do this in this order. We're going to sew the side seams last. So I can pin the last of the bit of the neckline from the shoulder to the back neck, and then I can go ahead and, again, right sides together, facing against the rest of the bodice, pin along the arm side, which is of course still open and flat like this because the side seams are not sewn yet. So side seams will be last. I can go ahead and sew right sides together all along the arm side. In the end, we will just pull this all right side out through the facing. It's just, again, usually you use this sort of facing for when you have a garment that has more like straps, and this has a full shoulder and a little bit of a tip-top collar, so it makes it seem like it's different. It's just the same as when you do a strapped garment with an all-in-one facing. I just imagine it has a very thick strap, as it were. I'm going to stitch this over on the machine, of course. Same half-inch seam allowance as everything else. Stitch that arm side like so. Back tacking, of course, at the start and end of that. And then I'll do the same for the neckline up here. Just this little bit of the neckline that's undone, meeting up where my original neckline stitching was. Now I would be able to clip all those curves and everything, but I'll just go ahead and sew the other side as well before I start that. So again, lining up the neckline, we have our facing and our garment right sides together. Line up that shoulder seam first, kind of pin the seam allowance out of the way, keep everything nice and smooth. Same for the arm side here. Again, line up the shoulder seam first, and then kind of line up the ends and pin in the middle. Especially with the fabric that has a tiny bit of stretch in it, you just kind of want to make sure you're not stretching any part of it out more than the other. And now it's finally time to actually clip all my curves, clip all of my corners, take out any extra little bits of fabric that I need to, like so. And then all this will be turned in on itself, so I'm not really worried about any of this coming undone or fraying. Like I've said, sateen holds its structure pretty well anyway, so definitely not worried about that. But because these are all very curvy, I want to make sure I put clips in here, especially with the points in the front neckline above the V. Without clipping those, you're not getting a sharp point, or anything close to a sharp point, that's for sure. And I'll just do all that clipping for both sides, of course, of my neckline and, again, the arm size. Like so. Alright, once everything is clipped, I can go ahead and pull my bodice out through my facing. So I'm pulling the backs out through the shoulder on each side. Sticking my arm in from the front, grabbing the backs, pulling them through the facing like a little tunnel. And now everything is all finished. And I just have, of course, go through and press all this nice and flat. If you want to throw understitching in there as much as you can at any stage of this process, you totally could as well. I just know that cotton sateen sticks to itself pretty well, so I'm not too worried about these things coming, like rolling onto the wrong side or anything like that. Also, because I'm facing this with the exact same fabric, if a little bit of the facing were to show, you wouldn't really be able to tell, especially in this busy tie-dye print going on here. Just using a piece of steel boning that was sitting here to help me poke my corners into shape. There we go. I like using the stiffness of my tailor's ham, which is of course stuffed with sawdust. So it's a little bit more hard packed than my sad ironing board. I would love an ironing board made out of like a harder material. Still needs to have some give to it. I need to be able to pin into it, but this ironing board is very sad. So I look forward to an upgraded ironing board in my next sewing room, that's for sure. But I'm just going to go all the way around, both the neckline and the arm size as well, making sure that all my corners are properly clipped and turned out and pressed, basically, so that everything is nice and smooth now that it's finished. I truly would love to make this dress in many other colorways, or dresses similar to this, just because I love the effect of the ice dyeing. It looks like either stone or a galaxy, and both of those things, I quite like galaxy print things, and I quite like marble or agate or jasper patterns as well, and that's kind of the combination of this. It's half galaxy, half jasper. I just think it's so fun. I would love to do a more like all reds and rusts and browns version of this. I would love to do an all purple version. You know, I have the all green top that I made, this top here, and the scarf I made in that colorway as well. But I wouldn't mind having a dress in the all green colorway as well. It's just so nice. Or that mousse color that I like so much. There's a dye from Dharma Trading Company that's one of their specialty dyes, and the color is called mousse because if you were to dye it in a single color dye bath, it would be a dark brown, but it splits apart into shades of like chartreuse and olive green, and then a burgundy-ish brown, and it's just the most delicious dye color. That's what this top is dyed with, mousse, and I would love to do a whole dress in mousse. That's right. I would love to have a mousse dress. Sounds very strange, but hopefully you get what I mean. There we go. Now I can go ahead and pin this side seam. See what our bodice looks like here, of course inside out, like so. And we're going to flip up those facings once again, just so that I can pin the side seam all flat like this. I mean, you could technically sew it with it folded down, but it's nicer to do it this way. So with that facing folded up, pin my side seam. Make sure I've got my dart flaps facing down. Same on the other side. Fold those facings up, match up that side seam, and because we're doing that side seam at the end of the bodice construction, everything else is already finished and ready to go. And we can actually start constructing the skirt, which, you know, what an idea. I did make this dress in one evening, by the way. One evening where someone else in the house was using the basement. How dare they? So I wasn't able to cut this fabric out on the floor in the basement, which is why I don't have any footage of me like with a final cutting layout for this, because I had to use the floor in my sewing room, and there's just not space to film me cutting on the floor while trying to cut on the floor, and it's kind of a nightmare. But that was the night I had to make this dress because I was leaving to go on a short trip to San Diego to visit my grandparents. I got back from London, was here for about 2 weeks, and I had to make this dress, and then I went on a short trip to visit my grandparents in San Diego because I hadn't seen them for a couple of years, and it was very nice to see them again and enjoy the lush foliage at their house because they have quite the view and quite the garden. And 2 very cute cats who are much larger, I would say twice the size of my cats. They're like full-size cats, and I have miniature cats for some reason. But I need to construct the underlayer of my skirt here, which again, one half is the geode fabric, and this piece is such a pretty piece of that geode fabric. Yummy. And then it's a bummer that it's the inside underside of the skirt. And then, of course, the other half of this skirt, I just used muslin. And then this has an angled hem on it, so I just wanted to make sure that I cut that off at a nice angle, just because the overskirt has an angle, the underskirt has a bit of an angle, just to make that work. And then I need to hem the overskirt layer before I can attach the overskirt and the underskirt layers together. So I'm just grabbing a piece of random bias tape. Obviously, use a color that matches. But I had this ivory bias tape already in my stash, and it was this or red, so I went with this. I don't know. You could even do ice-dyed bias tape if you wanted to. If you wanted to be very serious about it. If this was a couture situation, couture tie-dye, we would do tie-dyeing on the bias as well. Throw it in the muck water, see what happens. But of course I just sewed that bias onto the right side, and I'm turning it down onto the inside. It's double fold bias tape. I'll just pin that down, and I will hand stitch this to hem it with like a teal color of thread so that the little stitches aren't seen. And then I can sew the overskirt and the underskirt together. So I'm just going to layer those and then pin them together. Obviously this side has the muslin side. This is the like full side of the overskirt. The other side is cut away a little bit, and so the tie-dye side will show through. And I will pin these together and I'm going to baste them, but instead of basting them on the machine, I'm just going to run this through the serger. So I haven't serged the side seams on the front of the skirt yet. I went ahead and did the backs because that didn't matter, but I was waiting until I layered these two together to serge the waist seam and the side seams for this skirt. So I will do that now, matching up my darts here at the waist. I actually have these pressed alternating, so on the outside of the skirt, they are pressed towards the center. On the inside of the skirt, you can see my darts are pressed towards the side, just to reduce bulk here at the waist. Take it over here and just run that through the serger. And then I can treat this as any other pencil skirt, basically. I just have to sew my side seams and then press those, and I can sew this along the waist seam to my bodice. Not very many extra steps for the skirt, just a little bit more fiddly for the bodice. But again, it's not actually difficult once you understand what's happening. It's actually quite satisfying when you do these all-in-one facings. So yes, now that my skirt front is layered like so, I can go ahead and layer the side seams together. Of course, the print in this does not match at all. Like normally when you're cutting something out with a print, you would try and match the print along the side seam at least a little bit, hypothetically, but not possible in this organically printed fabric. We're going for a pieced stone look for the overall dress here. But yes, just sew my side seams in my pencil skirt. There's one side done. Here's the other side. I mean, there's this flap in the way, but you just sandwich it in between. No worries. It's not really in the way. It's all smooth anyhow. So 3 layers up here and then 2 layers, just the front and back for the rest of it. The underskirt and the back, I suppose. Hopefully you're following along with me now. As usual, I feel extra confusing, but again, hope that we're making up with any confusion today by getting to look at this fabric, because the things that the ice does while it melts, the ice and the dye are a magical combination, and truly gorgeous things happen. When you just set the ice and you walk away and you come back and all the magic has happened for you. But with the skirt done, I could pin the waist seam of the bodice and skirt together, of course matching up the side seams in the center front. And I will go ahead and stitch those together along the waist seam, 1/2 inch seam allowance again, same as always, just is my standard. And I can press that open and flat, of course. And then it will be time to put in a zipper. Everyone's favorite time. Line this up right side together along the center back of the seam. I'm going to grab a zipper and kind of decide how far down into the skirt that's going to come. And then I will sew like 8 inches down from there and then leave the last 8 inches of the skirt at the center back open for a slit, just so that I can, run Jurassic Park-like in this if I need to. I haven't actually seen that Jurassic Park movie. I just know it's a meme where the gal runs in heels. Which, if I were being chased by a dinosaur, I guess I would too. Although I'd probably ditch the shoes, honestly. I'd like to live. And I always leave myself more seam allowance down the center back, so that's what you're seeing here. It's kind of thick seam allowance. But I'll just press my seam allowance open on either side and set my zipper in. I like to do lapped zippers, as you know. This is a regular nylon coil zipper. I don't like invisible zippers. I find invisible zippers tend to break. I just don't love them. So early on, when I first learned to put zippers in, I only knew how to do invisible zippers. But that's how I learned that invisible zippers are not reliable. And they break too often for me. Like, after going through the pain of putting a zipper in, I don't want to ever have to replace it. So I stick with regular nylon zippers now. And I just grab these on mood. Whenever I place an order, I usually grab at least a couple of black zippers, because no matter what I'm making, I probably need more black zippers. I always have like 5 in hand, just in case. But here I am actually using the zipper foot over on the 99K to sew the other side of my overlapped zipper. I have a video all about how I set my zippers in, which you can find here. I'll put it up in a card. And of course, I will link it in the description as well. All right, zipper in. We're really close to finishing now. All I have to do is fold in the facing up here and fold that down along the zipper tape, and I will hand stitch that in. Just making sure that has the same 1 inch seam allowance here. Pressing that down, and then I'll fold it along the zipper tape. Same with the other side. Making sure that I could have just pressed this when I was pressing everything else, but that would have been advanced. All right, yes, fold this down along the zipper tape inside, like so. And I'll hand stitch this down along the zipper tape and along the back. You could get in there and machine stitch this actually, but I just found it easier to hand stitch it. Whatever. And then I will put hook and eyes again at the top of the back of the neck. I forgot to get footage of that, so that's a shame. But just, yeah, a couple hook and eyes up here. I did 3 of an antique brass hook and eye. And then to hem this, because it has a little bit of an angle in the front, I went ahead and used bias tape to hem this again. Just the rest of that ivory colored bias tape I had laying around. And here is the finished dress on my dress form. Of course, it does not fit this display form very well. It fits me far better. This form is smaller than I am. But I just wanted to take a couple of pictures of this garment, not on a body, because I think it's a little bit easier to see what's going on when it comes to the tie-dye print when I'm not wearing it, perhaps. Although on set, the set is quite busy with its rusty nonsense going on, so really it's kind of blending in here. But here's my finished tie-dye dress, and I'm very excited to wear it this summer. But overall, I am super pleased with how this dress came out and how this fabric came out. Of course, I'm still learning how to do larger pieces in this geode tied way. It can be hard to get full color saturation once you tie the fabric too thick. So that's why I try to use smaller pieces, just 1.5 to 2 yard pieces maximum to do the tie-dye itself. I don't know how people do like duvet covers and sheets and stuff like that. That seems very intense. I don't know how you get the saturation on those when the fabric starts getting really thick, but I guess sheet cotton is usually thinner than cotton sateen. The cotton sateen I use is a little on the thicker side, so there's lots of different variables when it comes to tie-dye, but I was really pleased with how this came out and how the dress came together. And of course, I did this top that I'm wearing here in the exact same way. This is my wrap back top pattern, which you can see in this video here, but I just did the same sort of a process to make this sateen. It's just all different shades of green. But I hope you enjoyed seeing how this dress came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back here with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.